And there was a paradox here too, that in that there was a high-tech industry, the rubber industry. It was at the cutting edge of the technology at the time. But this industry was dependent on brutal exploitation, but also the most primitive form of extraction of rubber. It was a wild rubber industry, largely in Africa and more so in Latin America, which involved tapping wild rubber trees in the forest and transporting the rubber, the latex rubber, by canoe and other means, and then finally it would make it to huge factories in Akron, Ohio, in France and in Britain and the other centres, the other heartlands of imperialism. So that was the paradox. And earlier I was talking with John, and he said there are a lot of parallels between then and now, and one parallel that springs immediately to my mind is these things that we all carry around today. I've lost mine, I'll put it somewhere else. No, mobile phones. We rely on coltan, of course, and this is the most high-tech cutting technology that we have today, that industry, but coltan's extracted under conditions which are very, very similar to the extraction of wild rubber in the Congo. It's also mildly radioactive, but mild and but strong enough, of course, to lead to cancer and birth defects among those unlucky enough to work at extracting it in the Congo. So I dedicated to those. Roger Casement, of course, was a great Irish nationalist. He's one of the Irish national heroes. He was a scion of the Anglo-Irish aristocracy from the north of Ireland. But yes, he was one person who most certainly started out as a humanitarian while in the employ of the British Crown, and he moved steadily leftwards as a result of studying the horrors in the Congo and also in the Putumayo, which he reported to the British Parliament on, and which, as John pointed out, shocked the world. It shocked the bourgeoisie also, because they were being exposed. British capitalists ran for cover. I should say also that American capitalists were involved in the Congo, and they were dissuaded only from continuing in the Congo after a campaign of what they described as yelping socialists. So more strength of the arm of the yelping American socialists today also. So Roger Casement, I dedicated to him. Walt Hardenberg was an American country boy, basically, who worked on the Panama Canal. And he was a young, adventurous, high-spirited person. He'd basically never had a political idea in his head in his life, and he thought the world was a wonderful place until he went to the Putumayo Valley. The Putumayo is a tributary of the Amazon, and the valley was the private fiefdom of a man called Arana, who was a rubber baron, and that was the site of true genocide. The Huitoto people, 40, 50, 60,000 of them were exterminated by Arana's thugs, and the reason for this was the collection of wild rubber. And Casement also exposed that, but Hardenberg stumbled across it, couldn't believe that anything like this could happen, and like a naive boy, he went to Arana himself and said, "You realise what's happening out there in the forest? People are being killed, people are being tortured to death, people are actually being cut up and fed to dogs." I'm not exaggerating. And Mr. Arana, of course, said, "Well, that's terrible." But then the scales dropped from his eyes, and he spent several years trying to bring this to the attention of the world. Morel, I've mentioned before, for his role in exposing the rubber trade. Edmund Dean Morel certainly joined up all the dots. During the First World War, he was imprisoned as an opponent of the war, and after that he was a left-wing Labor Party MP in Britain, and also the editor of that book, The Black Man's Burden. So there's a big difference between his earlier writings, when he was basically a humanitarian, and more strength to his arm when he was, of course, and later on when he became a conscious socialist and a conscious anti-imperialist, the same as Casement did. Emile van der Velde, of course, was the leader of the Belgian Socialist Party. He's usually reviled by Leninists, of course, but I won't go into the sectarian and ins and outs of it, except to say that he actually did an enormous job in the Belgian Parliament of exposing what was going on in the Congo. If you go to Brussels today, the capital of Belgium, of course, there's an immense triumphal arch, and that triumphal arch was built out of the proceeds of the rubber trade by Leopold. They're these huge neoclassical monstrosities all over that capital city, and Van der Velde dubbed the Arch of the Severed Hands, because this was what was done in the Congo to women, children and to men. If they didn't collect their quota of rubber and bring it in to Leopold's men, they were likely to have their hands chopped off as punishment. They were actually fed to dogs too, according to an American clergyman, a missionary who was there at that time. So that was what was happening in the Congo. So as Walter Benjamin said, no great invention without great barbarism, and I think the story of rubber bears it out. So that was why I dedicated to those people. And the Putumayo, as I say, the genocide in South America, it's actually ranked as a genocide by the standard work on the subject, which is a book called The History and Sociology of Genocides by Jonason and Chalk, both two American writers. Saldanha Roca, who I mentioned earlier, was a Peruvian Jewish Marxist. He was a very, very brave man because he dared to produce newspapers with the masthead dictatorship of the proletariat. I think that was enough to get him offside with the Peruvian bourgeoisie on the frontier, but also he was someone who campaigned indefatigably against what was happening to the indigenous population. I hate to say it too, but I think the depredations in the Congo and the Putumayo was just one part of basically what you could call a vast archipelago of suffering in the Amazon basin. This was just where the lid was sort of lifted. In other parts of that immense basin, the same sort of things were happening. Even as far north as Nicaragua and Central America, we also had genocide of Indian peoples, and the cause again was this greed for rubber. So I hate to say it, but the depredations themselves, I think, sure, the agitation of people like Casement and Morel were important, but I think that the main reason they stopped was the development of plantation rubber, and it was no longer commercially viable to harvest rubber. So from 1912 on, basically, plantation rubber overtook wild rubber as the principal source of this substance for the West. So the thieves were already out with their booty, if I could steal a phrase, of course, from the Internationale. The plantations were a new way of doing it. This was industrial style production. The plantations were enormous. It was agribusiness. It was one of the first instances. And so this rubber quickly became the second largest export commodity for the French in Indochina, also for the British in Malaya. It was just behind tin. For the Dutch in the Dutch East Indies at the time, it was also rapidly became an important export commodity. And there was a new barbarism which arose on the plantations. Of course, as Frantz Fanon said, that the world was, in the colonial world, was split down the middle. There was a colour bar in every walk of life, and particularly on the plantations. So you had this aristocracy at the top who were white. There were soaring mortality rates. On some of the plantations, it was around about 10%. Most of the deaths were due to overwork combined with poor nutrition, combined with filthy water supplies. One British medical officer said that Indian coolies, as they were called, Asian labourers, would return home like squeezed oranges. All the substance of life had been squeezed out of them. Things did get better. Partly as a result of the agitation of nationalists, trade unionists and such like, which I'll come on to next. There were great waves of strikes. Just before the Second World War broke out in Asia, there were two enormous strike waves, one of Chinese labourers and the second one of Indian labourers. And Malaya at that time was sort of compartmentalised. The Indians stayed to themselves, the Chinese stayed to themselves. If they'd have united together, perhaps the course of history might have been very, very different.